Every Saturday night, Sunday morning, if I do a sermon, I go over it again once or twice. But this time I thought, oh no, I can't. It's one of those subjects where you think, oh, I don't want to speak on this, but God says speak on it, so I've got to. And it opened my eyes. All my sermons always follow the same type of pattern, spot on. I asked God, what do you want me to speak on? And he said, this time, the crucifixion. Okay, what do you want me to say about it? 2, 3 days later, it's always the same amount of days. He said, the medical aspect of it. Right, okay. But when I looked into it, it was more than I ever thought it would be. I knew the crucifixion had to be painful by its nature, which, let's face it, it would be. But it was horrific. I think we should, to put things into perspective, if you think of it, Jesus was a carpenter, so he would have been a strong man. And he ate the Mediterranean diet, which a lot of people say is the healthiest diet in the world. As well as that, he did a lot of walking. He was strong, he was healthy. But I don't think that helped him when it came to the crucifixion, because he had to endure it a little bit longer. But even though Jesus knew what he was going to do, long before the world was created, the whole run-up to the crucifixion was stressful. That much is clear. In the Garden of Gethsemane, there were obvious signs of emotional stress and anxiety that Jesus was going through. Luke 22 verse 44 tells us, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. He didn't actually sweat blood, but his sweat was as blood. It's an extremely rare condition called hematidrosis. I don't know a lot about this because it's rare, it's not clearly understood. It normally happens when a person's under intense fear or stress, such as your body's in fight or flight mode. So we know Jesus was under extreme fear and stress, but the fact he still went through it shows us 3 things. 1, how much he loves us. 2, just how much courage he actually has. Nobody could call Jesus a coward. And 3, it shows how obedient he is to his Father's will. It's a perfect example for all of us, isn't it? Jesus was and is God, but he was also at the time a man. And he knew the terrible death that was just a few hours ahead of him. So it must have been awful at that time, but he still done it. After the fake trials had taken place, Jesus was scourged. Well, that's a form of whipping. It was so bad, so painful, that the Roman law forbid this punishment to be applied to Roman citizens. So what does that tell you? The victim was stripped completely naked, hung by his wrists to a wall or to a post. 2 hands up like that, on his knees, leaning forward. He was whipped on his shoulders, back, bare buttocks, down his legs and calves. The victim suffered 39 lashes from 2 big Roman soldiers standing on either side of him. The whip had a wooden handle which was about 18 inches long. It had 9 leather thongs, each about 6 foot long. At the end of each thong was a lead shod, which was a piece of metal right at the end of it, And attached to that lead shod were pieces of sheep bone and cattle bone. The idea was that at those pieces of bone, as the Roman legionnaire was beating his victim, he would flick his wrist and the bone would go into the person's body, and he would dig into the back where the bone cut the skin. It dug in under the surface of the skin, and he would literally rip shreds of muscle tissue out of the skin, leaving small ribbons of muscle about 2 inches long hanging out of the skin. Painful, isn't it? How many of us would willingly go and put up with that? And it's not even for yourself either. It's for your creation who'd turn their back on you. One thong, just one, would make a cut about 2 inches long, about 3/4 of an inch deep. To put that into medical terms, that would take about 20 stitches to close. So with one lash, one swing of the whip, a total of 9 lacerations could be inflicted on the victim. Each laceration about 2 inches long and 3/4 to 1 inch deep. With one blow, there would be enough wounds to take between 100 and up to 180 stitches to close. Multiply that by 39 times, which was the legal maximum amount of time a victim could be whipped. So those 2 Roman legionnaires inflicted enough cuts to take about 2,000 stitches to close. That's just the whipping alone. Jesus, you might ask yourself, well, why didn't Jesus bleed to death? It's because it was done in the cold night air, and that caused the blood vessels, the veins, the capillaries to contract, and that minimized the amount of blood loss. The idea of the lead weight was to lift the skeletal muscle out. Imagine having a cut on your skin with an inch of muscle pulled through the cut, exposed to the night air. The purpose of this was served in the scourging was, as the victim hung on the cross in the heat of the day, birds would land on them and peck these pieces of muscle, just like a bird pulling a worm out of the ground. And all the people were watching that and cheering. How long a person survived on the cross during the crucifixion was determined by how severely he was scourged. Sometimes a man would be beaten nearly to death before they put him on the cross, and he would last only a few hours. I know, but most of the time, the scourging was intended for public humiliation and embarrassment because it was such an inhumane method of torture. Now, we know Jesus was beaten in the face, punched in the head as he was mocked. Both of his eyes were swollen shut, and no doubt his nose was pouring blood. And if people are punched in the mouth enough, the first thing that happens is the lower teeth come through the lip. Jesus was tied and held and beaten in the face by these strong legionnaires. I don't think there's any doubt his lips were tattered like paper, and some of his teeth were knocked loose, maybe even knocked out. The initial beating alone was enough to induce the onset of hypervolemic shock. Now, this occurs when a person loses 20% or more of their blood. The blood loss depletes the body of oxygen, prevents the heart from pumping more blood, which results in even less oxygen reaching the cells. The cycle is vicious and can continue until the person dies from the condition. Now, the symptoms include nausea, profuse sweating, dizziness, confusion, and loss of consciousness. Jesus would have frequently vomited, which may have hastened the speed of suffocation as bodily fluids choked and gagged him, and he was already struggling to breathe. The crown of thorns was plaited and placed on his head to mock him as being king of the Jews. These thorns were about 1.5 to 2 inches long, and they're as sharp as an ice pick. The custom would have been to take a small 3-foot long reed, slap the thorns on the head of the victim, and push the thorns into the skull. Those thorns laid upon someone's head and then tapped down were hard enough to penetrate the outer bone of the skull. Imagine the bleeding from 300 or 400 puncture wounds in the scalp and around the forehead from these thorns. So, before the crucifixion even began, Jesus' face would have been beaten to a pulp, his eyes were swollen shut, his nose bloodied, and every pore in his skin wept and oozed blood. Every visible surface was covered and caked with blood. His back, his arms, his buttocks, the back of his legs, literally torn to shreds from the scourging. This was the shape Jesus was in, even before they gave him his cross to head out to Calvary. Sometimes the legionnaires would pull so much tissue from a person that if you looked at them from behind, you could actually see their lungs beating. So that wouldn't have been a nice sight to let his face it. And people were mocking him and laughing at that. If we examine the cross, we know from Corinthian and Roman history that the crosses were usually in 2 parts. The crossbar, from very good historical accounts, such as the 1st century Jewish historian Josephus, can be estimated to have a weight of 125 to 150 pounds. So when the final trial and condemnation had taken place, to maximise the shame and suffering, the custom was tie the crossbar to the victim and have him carry it from the point of condemnation to the point of execution. They carry the crossbar through the streets after being scourged and beaten, and the victim was always naked. So imagine how humiliating that would have been now. But in those times, even worse. The wood wasn't carved and smoothed and treated. It was a splintered, jagged tree which moved up and down the victim's back, shoving splinters into open wounds, and that continued after being nailed up. Every time the condemned person shifted weight from feet to arms and back to feet, up, down, their back rubbed against the splintered wood, causing a constant stabbing into the open flesh. Some of the wooden shreds remained lodged in the muscles and exposed nerve endings. Others tore the wounds even further apart, and then continued to streak the back with gore as the victim shifted. When Jesus fell, we can be sure he fell forwards, and if he did, he would have gone smack onto his face with 150 to 125 to 150 pounds on his back. But if he fell backwards, that would definitely have pulled his arms out of his sockets. The upright part of the cross was just like a post in the ground. Every major city at that time had an area outside their gates where they performed crucifixions. It wasn't just a form of execution, but a form of entertainment as well. Once someone condemned to crucifixion bore their cross through the streets, they would be thrown onto the ground and nails would be driven into their hands through the crossbar. And two forks, something like pitchforks, would be placed around each end of the crossbar. They would be lifted up and the crossbar hung on top of the upright post. When they were braced to the upright post, both feet would be nailed to the footpiece. The Romans had practiced crucifixion for hundreds of years, and they perfected the art of pain and suffering. They figured out if they drove the nail through a man's wrist right at the middle, they could avoid hitting any nerves or arteries or veins. If you look at the Hebrew word for hand, it's inclusive from the fingertips to about where your wristwatch crosses your wrist. And the nails would have been 5 to 7 inches long. Once hammered into the crossbeam, they would have been bent upwards to prevent the victim's hands sliding off the crossbeam. Tell you what, when I was coming in this morning, my stomach was turning at the thought of having to read this. So they had to drive the nails through the wrist, and in the wrist there's a very strong ligament called the transverse carpal ligament that's strong enough to support your body weight. The Romans figured out that if they came where the crease in the wrist is and drove the nail into that area, they would miss the radial artery, and they would also miss the ulnar artery on the little finger side. So what they did is they drove it through the biggest nerve in the hand called the median nerve. When that's cut in a straight line, it gives a sensation of having an electric cattle prod stuck to your wrist and a constant electric shock going through your hand. It causes the fingers to claw. They devised a way they could drive a spike through a man's hand and not lose one drop of blood, while maximising the amount of pain and suffering the person had to endure. So if the nail didn't cut the median nerve, it was right alongside of it. So as Jesus was pulling himself up and going down, he would have been rubbing across that nerve constantly. The Romans did the same thing with the feet. They calculated they could drive a nail through a man's foot and not cause blood loss that would cause the victim to bleed to death. By missing the dorus pedis artery, the nail misses the artery but hits the plantar nerves, causing the same horrible shock sensation. At the outset of the crucifixion, the victim's shoulders would dislocate. The vertical beam is in the ground. The victim carries the horizontal beam. The executioner nails him to it on the ground. The person's wrists are nailed into the horizontal beam. The executioner lifts and hammers it into the vertical beam. At this point, the victim's feet aren't nailed into the vertical beam, so he has nothing to push up with, and the weight of the hanging body, once raised, pulls the shoulders out of their sockets. The body then sinks lower, dislocating the wrists. The result is The arms are extended at least 6 inches beyond the normal span of reach. This causes the body to hang in an extended, slumped position, which forces the chest cavity to protrude outwards. The extended chest cavity does allow for inhalation, for breathing in, but makes breathing out almost impossible. So the effect is that carbon dioxide is not released from the body, so that builds up in the body as well. And as we know, they did eventually hang Jesus on the cross. John chapter 19 verse 18, where they crucified him and 2 others with him, one on either side and Jesus in the centre. Jesus would have been violently thrown backwards, then moved into place on the cross, which would have been grinding his wounds on the cross, as well as allowing dirt to enter into his wounds. The nails in his hands would have supported his body weight and would have torn at the wounds. Meanwhile, the simulation of the nerves in his feet would also have been causing him excruciating pain. As he's weakening on the cross, due to the weight in his wrists, excruciating pain shoots along his fingers, up his arms, and nails putting pressure on the median nerves. So Jesus would have pushed himself upwards to avoid the pain, placed his full weight on his feet, and this meant that the pain increased. So whatever he did, the pain couldn't avoid any severe pain. So the body doesn't get enough oxygen on the cross. So the natural response is to breathe faster. But he couldn't do that. So his heart was pumping faster, and it tries to overcompensate for the lack of oxygen. And then it goes into cardiac stress. And this can cause it to rupture inside the chest cavity. Symptoms of hyperventilation include fever and anxiety. Fever produces aches in the muscles. And since the muscles are already cramping and in spasm, this adds more complication to the severity of the pain. The victim is literally dying in the pain and from the pain. He is already exceedingly nervous and anxious. And coupling this with the body's psychological response makes for a sense of nervousness and central nervous system that most people today will never begin to experience in their lifetime. The victim is hung on the cross, and the knees are bent at a 45-degree angle, forcing the person to sustain the body with the thigh muscles. If you think about it, it's painful to bend the knees and support your weight on your thighs alone for even 5 minutes. You just have a go now, just go like that, for 5 minutes, bend your knees, and it is painful. I remember when I used to go to the gym, we used to do that as additional exercises just to make the muscles look a little bit better. Couldn't do it long. After a minute, you were in agony, and you had to force yourself to do it. Doing this, if you think about it, for hours, even days, the pain's unimaginable. But the victims had no choice. Jesus had no choice but to do that. So until the legs are fractured or become too tired from days of holding your body weight, they resist the cramping and resulting muscle spasms. Survival demands it. But the victim, even if they want to just relax enough to suffocate. They can't. They just can't do it. The natural way for our vital organs to receive oxygen is through the blood. And this depends on proper movement of the arms and legs. So you walk in your arms, legs swim. That helps to get the blood into the oxygen and around the body. But the cross interferes with this. Stationary arms and legs, together with gravity pulling the blood downwards, prevents your organs receiving the proper amount of oxygen. The organs then send a message to the brain saying, this isn't right. So the only way they can do that is by sending pain messages. So as well as all these other things going on, Jesus had to put up with every organ in his body sending pain messages to the brain, which meant every organ in his body was paining him at the same time. So the combined effect is immense physical pain and torture. And second, the process of crucifixion lasts a long time. In some cases, it was known to last as much as 10 days. It was far more painful than just 3 nails. It was an excruciating way to suffer and die. Over the years, people have come up with a lot of theories about how someone who was crucified dies. And the most probable one is that the victim suffocates after a number of hours or even days hanging on the cross. And the weight of the body pulling down on the chest complicates breathing. So the victim would support his weight by pushing up from the legs while pulling up on the wrists. And as he did this, the leg muscles would tire, so he'd have to allow his body to hang limp while struggling to breathe. And this continued until the leg muscles gave out, forcing the condemned to hang and to suffocate. Sometimes the executioner needed to end the crucifixion early. So they would do this by smashing the femur bone, which is this bone here, in the thigh, with a heavy mallet. That prevented the person from being able to push up and to reposition themselves for breathing. And that forced them to suffocate. But thankfully, Jesus didn't have to go through that. John chapter 19, verses 31 to 33 tell us, "Therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the bodies should not remain on the cross for the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who was crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs." John 19 verse 36 tells us that this was so scripture would be fulfilled. It was so we would know that Jesus fulfilled prophecies, leaving us in no doubt that he is the Messiah. Thirsty work this. Verse 36 says, "For these things were done, that the scripture should be fulfilled. Not one of his legs were broken." And the prophecy this refers to is in Psalm 34, verses 19 and 20. "Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him out of them all. He guards all his bones, not one of them is broken. Then, to make sure Jesus was actually dead and not merely unconscious, one Roman soldier pushed a spear into his side. John chapter 19, verse 34. But one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith there came out blood and water. People used to say this doesn't happen when the side is pierced, but doctors say it does happen. So this account has been proven to be medically correct. The fact that blood and water came out from the wound proves that Jesus was already dead when the Roman soldier thrust the spear into him. The mixture of blood and water shows the increased heartbeat Jesus' heart undertook in an effort to pump blood around his body caused fluid to gather in the sac around the heart and the lungs. Secular doctors who have examined Jesus' crucifixion say that he died from suffocation. But I don't think he did, although there may have been signs of this, because Jesus did lay down his own life. It wasn't taken from him. John chapter 19, verse 28. And after this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. Jesus knew the job he'd been sent to do had been successfully done. And let's be honest about it, Jesus was no coward, but there was no point in him going through that torture any longer than he needed to. And I'm glad he didn't. What he went through for us was enough without it lasting any longer than was necessary. Luke chapter 23, verse 46. And when Jesus had cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. And having said thus, he gave up the ghost. So the job was completed. Jesus had laid his life down. But that wasn't the end of it. 3 days later, God raised him from the dead. And Jesus, once and for all time, defeated Satan. Satan now knew the clock was running down and his time was coming to an end.